you very much for coming this morning to the seminar following the two wonderful Tanner lectures by Carlo Ginzburg these past 2 days. So my name is Blair. I'm a historian of early modern Europe, and I'll moderate this seminar. The format will be that we'll hear from two further commentators this morning, and we have the two commentators after each of the lectures with us also, Professor Robert Maryks of Boston College and Professor Lowell Gallagher of UCLA, who is in Los Angeles and is being Skyped in. And so, in fact, to be seen by him, if you're asking him a question, I think you should try and look at the green light that's on that little tripod table over there. Splendid. So I think what we'll do is start by hearing from our two commentators, and then Carlo Ginzburg may respond, and then we'll just have a general discussion with questions and contributions from the floor. So we've decided to go in a chronological order, roughly. Our first speaker then will be Mark Jordan, who's Mellon Professor of Christian Thought at the Harvard Divinity School and Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality in the FAS at Harvard. He teaches courses on the Western traditions of Christian theology, the relations of religion to modern art or literature, the current prospects for ethical persuasion. In years past, he has been appointed to various departments and institutes at Notre Dame, Emory, Washington University, and St. Louis. Most recently, he has published Convulsing Bodies, Religion and Resistance in Foucault, Stanford 2015, and forthcoming, Teaching Bodies, Moral Formation in the Summa of Thomas Aquinas. So, Mark, thanks for coming.
I'll let you guess which of those books is pertinent to my remarks today. The difficulty of coming at the end of such lectures, such responses, such conversations, is that all the clever things have been said. So forgive me for saying a few simple things in hopes of helping our conversation this morning. The relation of irony to the moral evaluation of cases is not new with Pascal, nor is it new to notice the long history. As the great Arnaud pointed out, Professor Ginzburg gives us the citation, God's ethical instruction of humankind begins, according to Genesis, with an ironic rebuke. Jesus continues to speak them, so too his followers. The history of Christian moral theology is filled with grand ironists. The same is evidently true of Western moral philosophy. So readers who found the Provincial Letters a transgressive, monstrous work had forgotten both their Augustine or Jerome and their Plato. Pascal had not forgotten them. He protests in part against the corruption of the speech of modern morals, its adulterated expectations of genres and methods in moral instruction. So the question for a reader of the Provincial Letters is not, why connect irony and moral cases, but which irony or whose irony, and in what relations to cases conceived in which ways? Professor Ginzburg has proved to us that the answers to those questions do not come easily. There are textual puzzles of many kinds, and an alert reader can have no confidence that the puzzles will be solved as easily as casuists' cases. A deeply ironic text can suffer many losses when it is transcribed into literal academic exegesis. But let me try to describe again some of the most obvious levels of irony in the Provincial Letters. I begin by picking up Professor Ginzburg's important distinction of persons or characters in the text. There is first the seeker, the depicted protagonist who goes in search of Jesuit doctrine. Then there is the correspondent, Louis de Montalt, who serves as reporter and commentator for an unspecified friend in the provinces. The correspondent speaks the I of the seeker, but also marks distances, as Plato's Socrates does, for example, when narrating his own conversations. What I mean is, although the seeker and the correspondent are the same person in one sense, in another sense, they are not the same person. Finally, there is the thinker, that is, the author of the unfinished set of fragments known as the Pensées, which constructs a scene of moral persuasion roughly the opposite of the scene of casuistry. So if we wanted to see Pascal's real response to casuistry, what we would do is go to the Pensée. By means of the authorial name Pascal, we associate the thinker of the Pensée with Louis de Montaut, correspondent of the letters. But we ought to be careful not to identify the two, just as we ought to be careful not to identify Plato with any of the figures in his dialogues, including Socrates. In the irony of pseudonymy, the first thing to be fractured is authorship. Now, my simple questions. What is it about Jesuit casuistry that so enrages the seeker as he goes about his interviews? The obvious answer is moral laxity. The Jesuits use casuistry to make it easier for sinners to continue sinning while soothing their consciences. And why is that enraging? Because, we hear, sinners are like sick people who need medicine, not false assurances and quack remedies. The outrage is an expression of pastoral concern, that is, of love. But the seeker also attacks the modernity of casuistry, its break with the Christian tradition, even as it pretends to perfect Christian tradition. This break leads to the seeker's third complaint, namely the dislocation of language in a moral nominalism. Indeed, the seeker's Jansenist friend uses one of the classical medieval descriptions of nominalism to describe what casuistry has done to moral speech. It has reduced words to mere sound, to wind. Among other harms, this nominalism encourages a purely political relation to contested views. So Arnaud's words are heresy, not because of what they mean, but because Arnaud writes them. In sum, the seeker discovers that moral laxity unmoors language, reduces it to a mere token in games of political power, and so deprives language of its capacity actually to teach morals, actually to help those suffering. I now put my simple question to the next character. What is it that enrages the correspondent, the pseudonymous Louis de Montaut? We learn in the first words of the first letter that he is enraged by deceit. We have been thoroughly fooled. That is the beginning of the letters. Fooled by the deceit of the manufactured controversy over Jansenius, but even more by the deceit that is Jesuit policy. As the letters proceed, the correspondent connects this deceit to what I think of as a systemic irony, not in the letters, but in the world that provoked them. We learn that the correspondent is praised by sympathetic readers for the fineness of his irony, or the delicacy of his irony. But what surrounds the correspondent is not delicate. It is a devouring irony. Those who charge him with clowning or scoffing have got things exactly backwards. If irony means dissembling, then it is the Jesuits who are deeply ironic first and always. The correspondent's irony can be fine or delicate because it need only reproduce the Jesuit irony, only picture it. He shows their vices by copying them lucidly. So, for example, the letters imitate the compendia of moral decisions. The letters are a manual of manuals or a digest of digests. The difference is that the correspondent recognizes the irony, marks the irony, while someone like the Jesuit father described here has attained the perfection of an irony that does not know itself to be irony, dissembling all the way through. Only that is not irony, but a sort of madness. In a system of irony that threatens to conquer the world, your only hope to moderate the madness is by writing irony more artfully. Here, the outrage of the correspondent becomes the outrage of the thinker, the author of the Pensée. What is it that outrages the thinker about casuistry? All the things already mentioned, to be sure, but there is something more. The thinker is offended by the pretense of applying a quasi-mathematical method to the Christian tradition of morals. The comparison and arbitration of conflicting opinions is not only fake mathematics, it is an authorization for cheap certainties. What begins as a methodological scruple, how can I be sure what to do, becomes a method of reductive description that produces pseudo-certainty. Let me say this again. We observe in the Pensée an assiduous labor of rewriting, an exertion to describe, to register as finely as possible the moral situation of various human souls in order to address them persuasively, at once tenderly, soberly, and effectively. For a writer like the thinker, like Pascal, the confident prolixity of Jesuit moral manuals, their marketing success, must seem an industrialized debasement of speech. The thinker says as much in one of the Pensée fragments on the casuists. He writes, "Their great number, far from marking their perfection, marks the contrary, the humility of a single fact, the pride of many." The humility of a single fact, the pride of many. The humility of a single fact, the daunting difficulty of representing a single episode in a single life, as opposed to the betrayal of that episode into a mere case for calculation. So, Pascal is convinced that this method of casuistry is something new. I agree with him. As I suggested in our conversation yesterday, the method in Escobar, to name one example, is not the method of case analysis one finds in the 12th or 13th or even early 14th century treatment of cases. There are many differences, but let me name only three. First, the method of modern casuistry depends upon a propositional notion of both natural and divine law, and so alters the relation of law to cases. Second, modern casuistry breaks the medieval connection between casus and exemplum, between moral case and moral example, and so alters both the pedagogy of narrative and the narrative relations between single action and whole life. Third, as I've suggested, the calculus of probabilities in modern casuistry acknowledges doubt only to palliate it with an ersatz certainty, thus undoing the profound epistemic reserve of the medieval method of case analysis. Emphasizing the newness of Jesuit casuistry, Pascal is again mirroring a claim that some Jesuits make for their own alluring modernity. Consider, for example, Antonio de Escobar y Mendoza's Moral Theology of 24 Theologians of the Society of Jesus, published in 1644. This is the text to which the correspondent returns so regularly. If you open the book, you find an extended allegory drawn from the book of Revelations. The seven seals are interpreted as schemes for arranging the kinds of law, the types of sin, the acts of judgment, the classes of church judgments, the virtues, the states of life, and the sacraments. The four visionary figures in the book of Revelations, the ox, eagle, man, and lion, become not the four evangelists, but four Jesuit theologians, Suarez, Vasquez, Molina, and Valencia. The 24 elders who stand around the throne of the apocalyptic Lamb are also all Jesuit. Indeed, they are the 24 moral theologians mentioned in Escobar's title. In sum, Jesuit casuistry is here represented allegorically as the fulfillment of salvation history. Modern casuistry is the eschaton. Pascal's insistence on the innovations of Jesuit casuistry brings us to Professor Ginzburg's larger questions about the consequences or aftermath of the provincial letters, and so to Francesco Orlando and the trajectory from Pascal's attack on casuistry into larger attacks in late modernity on religion. I confess that I am not persuaded by this for two reasons, with which I will end. First, it is notorious that Christianity, like other monotheisms, carries atheism within it, since it seeks to disprove both other gods and the heretical misunderstandings of the one true God. In carrying out these attacks, Christian scriptures and Christian theologians have regularly employed just the sort of irony that Pascal unleashes. Indeed, they have used much stronger ironies, as in the quarrels between secular and mendicant priests in the 13th century, or in the quarrels among the religious orders between then and Pascal's time. In the mendicant quarrel, the apocalyptic imagery is deployed to depict the Dominicans and Franciscans as children of the Antichrist. So I do not see why Pascal's irony in the letters would be the origin of a trajectory into enlightened unbelief, although the letters might be an important step in that trajectory. But I am also not persuaded of Orlando's suggestion because I worry about the assumptions of continuity in reception. Let me end with an analogy to the reception of another moral intervention, Thomas Aquinas' Summa of Theology. To speak too simply, I would say that the official success of the Summa over centuries comes at the cost of its actual originality. What made it famous and useful to church authorities was precisely not what Thomas meant to accomplish in it. Let me go a bit further. Any exegetical tradition will change with shifts in what we call intellectual context, for want of an adequate term. Such changes are often imperceptible to those inside them. They are concealed behind the material continuities of textual inheritance. A contemporary reader of the Summa can discover such changes by tracking the succession of Thomistic readings for a single passage or term. Consider the case of natural law, as read from the 16th century through the 19th century, say by Cajetan, Vittoria Suarez de Salmanticenses, and Matteo Liberatore. While each of these authors wants in some sense to be faithful to Thomas, the conception of natural law undergoes striking mutations over the course of their readings. These authors cite exactly the same passages from the Summa, but they change the meaning and the use of those passages profoundly. The passages are the same only materially, neither conceptually nor pedagogically. In what sense, then, can these mutating readings be called consequences of the Summa, or part of its trajectory? The reception of the provincial letters is neither so broad nor so official as that of Thomas's Summa, but it is equally political. Pascal's text is claimed by a controversial series of sequels. But which of them are consequences of the letters and which impositions on the letters or accidents that happen around the letters? If this question does nothing else, it may remind us of the ambiguities in the word reception, which implies a rather different set of relations than the word consequences. I am very interested in reception, but I am not yet ready to sign up for the historiography of consequences. Thank you.
Well, shall we move on to the second commentator?
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
sounds good. Tremendous. Thank you so much, Professor Jordan. I should say we've gathered here really an interdisciplinary group of commentators because Professor Maryks is a historian, Professor Gallagher is a literary scholar, we've had a theologian, and now we're going to hear from a philosopher. So Francis Kamm is Litauer Professor of Philosophy and Public Policy at the Kennedy School and also professor in the FAS Department of Philosophy at Harvard. She's the author of many books in bioethics, for example, Creation and Abortion, Morality, Mortality, in 2 volumes, Intricate Ethics, Ethics for Enemies, Terror, Torture, and War, The Moral Target, Aiming at Right Conduct in War and Other Conflicts, and Bioethical Prescriptions, among others. She's also published many articles on normative ethical theory, practical ethics. She's held fellowships from the ACLS, the AAUW, NEH, and Guggenheim Foundations. She's been a fellow of the Program in Ethics and the Professions at the Kennedy School, at the Center for Human Values at Princeton, at the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford, and in 2013, she delivered the Tanner Lectures in Human Values, not here, but at the University of California, Berkeley, because there are about 9 institutions where these lectures have been endowed. She's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Kamm.
Yeah, now for something completely different. Can you hear me with this? Yeah, this is really going to be different. I'm not a historian. I'm not even a historian of philosophy. I think the reason I was invited, and I'm eternally grateful that I was, is that in the very first page of the lectures that we heard, a footnote referred to the rebirth of a casuistry in bioethics. And I think that set off someone. And I think that's the reason I'm here. But all I can do, really, and all I intend to do, is try to make clear the way in which modern moral philosophy, not just bioethics, but bioethics as well, makes use of cases, and see whether you think there's any connection with the more traditional casuistry or so-called modern casuistry of the period that the lectures discussed. So in my mind, casuistry is traditionally associated with attempting to apply general moral principles to cases, which often calls for drawing moral distinctions between cases, and often refining the principles themselves. This enterprise, note, is not the same as overriding the principles for reasons of self-interest or for what some call necessity, which are typical complaints about the use of casuistry. Now, in the comments that I'm going to make today, I first want to very briefly show by a few examples that in at least one way of doing modern moral philosophy, and by that I mean contemporary moral philosophy. I don't mean Descartes period, in that sense of modern. Cases and the refinement of principles play a role in this version of philosophy I'm going to discuss. So a minimal role for cases in this way of philosophizing involves using them as counterexamples that help defeat the adequacy of a proposed general principle or moral theory. For example, and here I've tried to choose examples that connect up with the discussions we've had over the past few days. Suppose someone proposes the principle that, quote, it is always wrong to kill persons, end quote. An implication of this principle seems to be that it is wrong for someone to kill an aggressor who was deliberately trying to kill her for bad reasons, when killing that aggressor is necessary to save her life. Now, a moral philosopher who thinks that such a killing in self-defense is permissible would see it as a justified act, not merely one that is excusable as an exception to the correct principle of not killing persons, let us say an exception on grounds of necessity or self-interest in avoiding the costs of abiding by the correct principle. That's not at all the way the modern moral philosopher would see this. One reason to think that the philosopher sees it the way I described, as justified, not merely excused act, is how the philosophers can distinguish this self-defensive killing and say that it could be permissible, even if another killing that would also be necessary to save that person's life from being attacked by the aggressor would be impermissible. For example, suppose the original aggressor in my example will kill the one person if she does not kill an innocent bystander whose death the aggressor is seeking. So the aggressor threatens her with death if she doesn't kill a bystander. In this case, it would also be costly for her if she does not kill the bystander. It also seems like a matter of necessity, so to speak, to save her life. And yet it would be impermissible for her to do so. So what is the distinction between the two cases? The first of self-defensive killing against an aggressor and self-preservative killing by killing a bystander. What's the difference? What makes the difference in permissibility? Even though both would involve killing as a means of, quote, dealing with an evil world, an accommodation, so to speak. In the first case, the person killed is the aggressor. Killing him stops his original attempt to violate the principle not to kill persons, and it involves killing someone who may have forfeited his right not to be killed by having threatened others. In the second case, the bystander who would be killed has not forfeited his right not to be killed. He's done nothing. And he is not liable to being killed merely as a tool to save the life of another. Now, these are the factors that I think a philosopher would point to justify the distinction, and they have nothing to do with necessity, self-interest, overriding principles. Rather, there are underlying principles that explain why you're justified in acting that don't encompass all cases where such action would be necessary to save one's life. Now, suppose there are some justified cases of killing, such as killing the aggressor. Then the original principle that, quote, it is always wrong to kill persons is shown to be too broad. It requires refinement, at least if it is to be more than what is known as a prima facie principle. A prima facie principle is one that points to a factor, such as killing someone, that usually counts against an act, but which sometimes can be shown to be less important than factors that count in favor of an act, or can sometimes be shown to be undermined in the circumstances, as, for example, when someone forfeits his right not to be killed in virtue of his own conduct. It's important to realize, one way to go here is to say, I'm no longer interested in finding refined principles. I'm just interested in, considering various factors that are relevant, and some philosophers have gone in that direction. But if we take the direction of trying to get a more refined principle, it's important to realize that the initial principle of not killing persons, the one that we began with, is not to be seen as an ultimate divine command of some sort. Hence, showing that it does not always yield the correct implication for cases, because killing is sometimes justified, need not be an example of what someone in this seminar has called human needs being in tension with moral truth. And this is not because there is no moral truth, either at the level of general moral principles or judgments about particular cases. Rather, an alternative view is that there are overarching reasons that account for why it is often wrong to kill persons that may well have prompted proposing the original principle, it's always wrong to kill persons, and these same overarching reasons, along with other reasons, such as I've presented, forfeiture or something, can help us justify refining a principle that may be too broad. You mustn't see the principle as the end-all and be-all. There are reasons behind every principle, and these can be used to further refine, help us understand the range of a principle. Okay, now, secondly, if cases can be used in this way to rebut the adequacy of a principle or theory, they can also help in a second way, to develop perhaps an alternative principle or theory. So, for example, on the basis of the cases I have so far presented, we might develop a refined principle. Quote, never kill innocent persons. Innocent. Are there counter cases to this principle, however? In the morality of war, it is sometimes thought to be justified to bomb, let us say, a munitions factory when this is necessary to win a just cause, even though a few innocent bystanders will be killed foreseeably. Some argue that this is permissible, this bombing, in part because those bystander deaths are not intended even though they are foreseen with certainty to occur. On these grounds also, intentionally killing the same or even fewer numbers of innocent bystanders, let us say in a terrorist attack, is thought to be ruled out, even if it would be necessary to win the just cause, because the idea is you mustn't intentionally kill the innocent. I'm not saying I support this view, but it has been proposed. So now the idea is that a proposal is being made that the correct principle is, quote, never intentionally kill the innocent. This is a third principle. But now suppose the bombardier who would hit the munitions factory with his bombs, suppose he only takes the assignment because he realizes that some innocent bystanders will be killed. And it has always been his intention to do what will kill some innocent bystanders. This is his state of mind, his intentions. Is his bombing the factory, whose destruction will win the war, impermissible due to his intention to kill the innocent? Even though all the same factors are present that would justify the bombing, the same bombing of the same factory with the same number of deaths of innocents, by a bombardier who had only good intentions to win the war? I actually doubt it. I don't actually think the intentions make a difference to permissibility. But I might be wrong. Still, there's another case to consider. Let's suppose voluntary euthanasia, in which a patient asks a doctor to kill him in order to stop his suffering through a terminal illness. If this killing is permissible because it is authorized by the innocent person himself, it will not be true that it is always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent person. Now, my point here is to show how cases have been used and are used in modern moral philosophy to evaluate the merits of principles. Look at the implication of the principle for a case. Consider whether you have a counterexample. All right? Maybe you have to refine the principle. Perhaps you have to revise your judgment about the case. Some people call this reflective equilibrium, going back and forth. Now, I've been considering a role for cases in identifying correct moral principles. And this is part of the enterprise of moral theory, normative moral theory. But in modern practical ethics, such as bioethics, consideration of cases has come to play a large role for a different, though related, reason. In the practical disciplines like bioethics, we are primarily concerned with getting an answer to a very specific question about what to do. For example, whether it's permissible to have an abortion, and whether how we should allocate a scarce resource, various other sorts of complicated questions. And there is rarely a direct route from a moral theory or principle to a conclusion about a complex real-life case. Part of the reason for this is that many principles that have been proposed are not quite right, as evidenced by the previous description I gave of proposed principles and counter cases to them. In addition, considering the complex case directly can allow us, many think, to see factors in the case that may be morally relevant to arguing for a decision about what to do in the case, but that no simple principle yet formulated captures. You don't want to close your eyes to what's in front of you simply because no principle has heretofore paid attention to it. For example, some have thought that it would be a good idea to consider whether abortion could be permissible even if the fetus were assumed for the sake of argument to be a person. Then the question would be whether abortion, let us say, can be seen to be a case of permissible or perhaps impermissible killing in self or other defense. How could this be so? How could it be permissible self-defense or other defense if the fetus is not a conscious aggressor? Perhaps because even if someone is morally innocent, they can unintentionally present a threat, unlike a mere bystander who was innocent but presented no threat. Present a threat to another that one might permissibly resist. independent of the moral innocence of the individual. But more than that, when we look at the abortion case, we think some people have thought it might be morally relevant that the fetus presents a threat to another person while occupying, in quotes, territory that belongs to that person. And it presents the threat because it is drawing life-sustaining benefits from the use of that person's territory. Now, when you put these factors together, and here, a very famous article that you may know about, Judith Thompson's A Defense of Abortion, raises these sort of very same issues, right? And I'm going to come back to Thompson in a moment. Now, killing such a threat that occupies the territory of the individual it threatens and draws its ability to threaten by deriving life from that territory, to kill such a threat might deprive it only of life that it gets from being where it has no right to be. Now, this factor, or these sets of factors that I presented, might be relevant to deciding whether a killing is permissible. And only examining the case in detail, and this is the methodological point, can bring these factors to light. They may not have been in anybody's principles. It may not have been seen that if they weren't anybody's principles, that this particular case was an instance of them. Look at the case. That's the point in practical ethics, I think, when people refer to the use of cases there. Now, in conclusion, I would just briefly like to speak to the role of irony and humor in the sort of modern moral philosophy I've been discussing, since its role in Pascal has been emphasized by Professor Ginzburg. Some of the cases that are used as counterexamples to one principle or in defense of another are humorous in modern moral philosophy. Sometimes this is a side effect of having to construct highly unrealistic hypothetical cases that have just the right set of factors in them that are needed to test a theory or principle. It's like scientific experiment in the lab. You're trying to see whether a particular theory is correct or not. You've got to construct a great experiment that will test for those factors and no others, okay? It was for such a purpose that the philosopher Philippa Foot, who, by the way, was the originator of the famous trolley problem, subject matter of my forthcoming book, put in a plug, okay? Philippa Foot, for such a purpose, discussed a case in which a fat person is stuck in the mouth of a cave, his head outside, while floodwaters are rising within the cave where 5 other people are trapped. And after presenting cases of this sort, she explicitly said that she hoped, quote, the levity did not give offense as none was intended, end quote. Now, sometimes humorous properties are deliberately added in discussions, I think. For example, in one of the most famous cases in contemporary moral philosophy, Judith Thompson imagined that a society of music lovers tries to save the life of a famous violinist who is dying of kidney failure by plugging him into your kidneys without your consent. Thompson's aim was to see what I was trying to talk about before, whether abortion would be permissible even if the fetus were assumed for the sake of argument to be a person. And so she constructed a case, a non-abortion case, that was meant to be analogous to a case of pregnancy, perhaps due to rape. Without your consent, someone is plugged into you. Now, I suspect that the humorous detail of a music society devoted to its violinist helps to get people to think in a detached and hence rigorous way about a sometimes emotional moral issue. Obviously, using an analogous case helps also, rather than just reeling head-on with the case of the fetus. Finally, sometimes the deliberate humor in examples is meant to transmit how ridiculous a particular theory or principle strikes a philosopher. Not all philosophers, but a particular philosopher. An example is present in Jonathan Bennett's own Tanner lectures from the 1960s, when he attacked the possibility of using the conceptual distinction between intending an outcome and merely foreseeing it. I introduced that distinction, as you recall, earlier when I discussed the bombardier. He attacked the possibility of using that distinction to ground a morally significant distinction. Okay, he said, it's a conceptual distinction, but what moral significance does it have? And he imagined the following sort of case, in which someone, again a wartime example, drops a bomb on a civilian, intending only Bennett, this is Bennett's idea, the bombardier intends only to blow the civilian to bits so that his compatriots will petition their government for surrender, or to surrender. But the bombardier has no objection to the bits coming back together eventually so that the person will not die and can go on living once the war is over. Of course, the bombardier foresees that the bits will not come back together and the person will die, but that doesn't mean he intended the person's death. Okay. And this is the Bennett that I'm channeling. This is the voice of Bennett now. So his claim was, could this distinction, admittedly, there's an intention-foresight distinction, possibly be relevant to whether the act of dropping the bomb is permissible? And he was trying to get you to say no. And he wanted to go back and say, in my original case, you know, when you drop the bomb in the munitions factory, and you know with certainty there are going to bystanders are going to be killed, what difference is the moral role of intention and foresight in any case? Now, when philosophers make use of cases that have a humorous side, whether intended or a mere side effect, to make use of the distinction once again, they do not, or at least should not, mean to win an argument with the humor. One must always keep one's eye on the actual properties of the case, for example, Bennett's case in this last example, and consider whether it hits its target. Is it effective? Don't get sidetracked by the humor and think, oh, I have not to think further about the actual case. That would be a misuse of humor in philosophy. And actually, if a philosopher thought that that might be the effect of their humor, they should probably avoid it. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Kamm. Professor Carlo Ginzburg needs no introduction at this point.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to debate about my own work in this context and having so deeply thought commentaries. Let me start from the last sentence of Professor Jordan's intervention. He says, I'm very interested in reception, but I'm not quite ready to sign up for the historiography of consequences. I completely agree. In other words, I think that reception, an issue which has been evoked yesterday, is an extremely fruitful topic, still largely unknown in its implications. Consequences, well, this is a word which I used in order to make a kind of paradox, because I said, okay, we are speaking about unintended consequences, this is a sort of cliche, but I said this is not, let's say, the exception, is the norm. So if this is the norm, I mean, we can say intentions are part of a larger picture, and the very word consequences should be looked at in a different perspective. So I took the cliche, but I did not sign up for the category. But I have problems with your own interpretation of reception. Let me explain why. textual philology has been evoked yesterday. So we are familiar with techniques which allow us to reconstruct texts, sometimes with nearly certainty, sometimes this is not the case, but texts which were produced in a different context, in a different society, according to their original version. I would say this time maybe original in quotation marks, because it's a sort of tentative reconstruction, but we can say that some reconstructions can be immediately rejected, saying this is false. Now, this distinction between what is true and what is false and what is only probable seems to me something which is at the very center of our debate and cannot be dismissed for any reason. So when, let's say, the emphasis on the creative element of reception implies the assumption that no original text was there, I am strongly against it. It happened to me many years ago to be involved in a debate in which an issue was present, meaning the impossibility for somebody to reject the so-called arguments or pseudo-arguments, alleged arguments of Shoah deniers, because even if those arguments were regarded as dreadful and from a moral, political point of view, it was impossible to refute them. Now, I think that this is a crucial test. If we abandon the possibility of making an argument based on proofs and based also on the distinction between, let's say, a text as it was, let's say, written, for instance, and as it was received, we are completely lost. So I would say I'm ready to accept that reception implies a reworking of a message, of a text or a visual experience and so on, but I think it's still possible to make a distinction between the reception of a text and the text itself. In principle, sometimes, it's impossible to use textual philology, but I think the distinction should be maintained. Now, what's the point here? I think the point is about the impact, the aftermath. I don't know whether aftermath is better than consequences. But anyway, so let's use a word which points to a sequence in which there is a text having an impact involving multiple reception and so on. Now, Francesco Orlando's argument, which I tried to develop, pointed at, not for the first time, at the connection between Pascal's text, not only, let's say, Les Provinciales, but also Les Pensées, but in this case, Les Provinciales, and, let's say, its reception in the Enlightenment. Now, I am deeply convinced that what we call Enlightenment had deep Christian roots, but this is not synonymous with saying that the Enlightenment was a Christian phenomenon. On the contrary, there was a strong impulse towards what we can call secularization. I would prefer secularization than modernity, because modernity seems to me a word which is a sort of, as a sort of ideological charge, which I find disturbing. Or, if not ideological, there is an element of a tautological element. We are moderns, so what? But if we look, as I mentioned quickly in one of my lectures, the contradictory and troubling legacy of the Enlightenment, well, we are on a ground which is close to secularization. We can say, well, after Pascal, something happened, and I think that the best illustration today of that something which happened has been provided by Professor Kamm talk. Because, I mean, the difference between casuistry in the, should I say pre-modern? Well, let's say in a sense which was shared as a meaning both by Pascal and his targets, and the use of cases in your argument seems to me clear. I mean, you said we are not taking norm in any divine sense. So something like secularization is involved. Something happened. Now, this something is extremely contradictory, as we know, because, I mean, we live, and I also mentioned this because this is the background of our discussion, meaning we live in a world in which religions clash every day. Every day. So, I mean, also as a response to secularization. So this is the, let's say, the background. And at the very beginning of my lecture, I said this issue of using derision and irony in dealing with religious matters is something which became, I mean, a burning issue more and more. So, I mean, we are talking about today, but also looking at the past from a contemporary point of view. Now, the break seems to me clear. I mean, I'm not so attracted by some of the examples you mentioned. I mean, this kind of academic humor seems to me sometimes of bad taste. I think that, let's say, Pascal's case was completely different. I mean, in terms of a literary quality. But what's interesting here, and what was interesting to you, was the fact that we can use cases as mental experiments. Now, this seems to me a crucial point. In other words, let's imagine, let's start from the notion of legal fiction in Roman law. So, I mean, the very word fictio was used in Roman law in this perspective. So let's imagine that. And this would become a law. Fictio from fingo, from mold. And then there is a mental experiment which is innocent. In other words, we are saying, well, what about, let's say, this as-if situation? This is not going to become reality. We are simply trying to explore some possibilities. But I think that what is changing is not the notion, what has been changing is not the notion of cases, it's the notion of norm. In other words, the tension I mentioned repeatedly yesterday between norms and exceptions becomes different if the status of the norm becomes different. This seems to me a major break. Now, was Pascal involved in this break unintentionally? I would say yes. Which is interesting because it can help us to avoid anachronisms. For instance, I mean, to read Pascal as a contemporary of Voltaire. He was not. But there was a connection. So again, I would emphasize both continuity and discontinuity. We can, let's say, try to retrieve the meaning. I would strongly insist on this. We can try to retrieve the original meaning of a text. I would say the true meaning in the sense of a human truth as a human construction, which can be falsified. But we can recover. We can try to recover the true meaning of a text, and then we can work on its reception as something which is at the same time related and unrelated to the original text. So the point is to see how this reworking works.
Thanks very much. I wonder if Professor Gallagher, who hasn't actually had the chance to have a back and forth with Carlo Ginzburg, because we couldn't Skype him in yesterday, would like to have the first sort of interaction, maybe.
Thank you very much.
Look over there, I think, Carlo. Carlo. He sees you best if you look, but it's very disconcerting.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful for the chance to enter into the conversation. I would like to actually, if I could, I would like to see whether I could help promote a conversation between Carlo and Mark about a point that Mark made this morning. And it has to do with something that I believe I alluded to in my remarks. It has to do, again, with the question of context and with the difficulties of coming up with adequate perceptual schemes for mapping the pluralities of contexts that exist in any given moment. I'm actually really just siphoning Paul Ricoeur and a certain stripe of philosophical hermeneutics here, but what really struck me was the way that Mark was, I think, gesturing toward a sense of the marketplace of values that we see coming into form in the provincial letters, where the Jesuit casuist, and certainly in the first part of the provincial letters, represents a kind of mapping or a marking by Pascal of a local context that is absolutely unavailable for dialogue. That what we see is not a context, but a fractured one already in the provincial letters. And Mark seems to be suggesting, unless I'm misinterpreting him, that this has something to do with a particular understanding of print culture and how value has migrated from some transcendent sphere to the simple material availability of multiple opinions, and the gauge for assessing them is retreating into the far horizon. And that's what the casuist seems to be representing. So what we see there, I think, is a kind of fracturing of the context where one voice has a future that we recognize. It's the secular moment, I think, that Carlo was talking about. And another voice, which is Pascal's, well, it doesn't have the same future, right? It has a future that now can only be reached in very highly specialized communities that don't share a common language. I was just wondering whether that might be a point of merger between Mark's points and Carlo's perceptions. It's the question of the marketplace and of print and of the ways in which that material phenomenon actually affects the understanding of what counts as a value.
Would you like to comment?
No, copy.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting, and I think that your point about context is extremely appropriate in this context. Let me give just one example, which I mentioned in one of my lectures, but I think it would be helpful to make a further comment on it. As I argued, Pascal was using materials which had been already filtered by Nicolas Perrault. There were headings, texts selected from previously published works by Jesuits, and so on. So Pascal was using them, and then he made a mistake, inadvertently, which was in fact Nicolas Perrault's mistake. Nicolas Perrault quoted Lessius, a Jesuit, on, let's say, legitimacy on the legitimate murder in order to defend one's honor. And in fact, Perrault missed the point because Lessius was mentioning other people's remarks on this issue, but not subscribing them. So we have, let's say, a text, its reception through Perrault, and then Perrault being read and reworked by Pascal, and then somebody saying, but actually Lessius didn't say that. And so Pascal corrected himself. Now we are, let's say, in a context which is a context which is quite large. In other words, there are, let's say, invisible readers reading the Provinciales and Pascal reacting to them. And so there is a point which is actually the point I was making before. In other words, somebody can point out at Lessius' text and say, but he's not saying exactly this. So this is a misreading. This is philology in everyday life. Something which we cannot get rid of. I remember a joking remark made by a friend who was a historian about, he said, but those skeptics are less skeptics when they are dealing with their credit card number. Now, this is not a stupid joke. I mean, the man is not stupid. In other words, our way of dealing with the world implies, let's say, all those sophisticated techniques at a basic level. And we make, at every moment, a distinction between what is true, what is false, sometimes we are wrong, what is fictional, and so on and so forth. So I think that, let's say, the printing press did not destroy this. Simply, it gave the possibility of a quick reaction of invisible readers to Pascal's misreading mediated by Nicolas Perrault's misreading. I think we are still there. Notwithstanding, let's say, the shift from a less secular to a more secular age. Yeah.
I see what you're saying. The question of speed is really important there. I agree with that.
Yeah, the question of speed is important. In other words, and I mean, obviously, we are all thinking about that incredible fastness which is related to the web and so on. How this is going to accept our perceptions, this is one thing. But I wonder whether the basic categories did in fact change. I don't think so.
Mark, did you want to pick up on?
Carlo, let me try it again, because I'm not sure we're disagreeing. So there's a certain sense in which, to pick up on what Lowell was saying, there's a certain sense in which Pascal in the letters can be represented as right on the tide of the rising speed, right? He's writing very quickly. He's writing, as you said, a feuilleton, so he's blogging, right, in response to the Jesuits, right? And so in that sense, Pascal looks like he's completely with the changing technologies of print and their circulation. At the same time, of course, Pascal is deeply troubled by the assumption that human lives, for example, can be accurately represented, reduced to atomic cases, and weighed one against another. So he's very worried about the assumption, the moral assumption of representability, which goes into this accelerating speed. And so in that sense, he's writing, as it were, into the Jesuits' world, right? But he's writing in such a way as to put a drag. This is the sand in the machine of repression. He's writing so to put a drag, to raise the old question. What is it actually to write human lives? What is it to compare cases one to another? Yes, so far?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you picked up a beautiful quotation, which is absolutely appropriate in this context. The humility of a single fact, the pride of many. So the humility of a single fact, that's absolutely crucial. You are right. In other words, one could say on that ground, there was a potential communication between Pascal and the Jesuits, but only potential. Because when you are so close, you fight.
Yes. No, and that's what I meant to say, I think, right? That the fight between Pascal and the Jesuits is not about cases. It's about the technique of modern casuistry. Because Pascal is himself deeply committed to the individuality of moral writing, to the personal address, to the difficulty of the representation of the individual. It's indeed, his protest is, I think, indeed, that the Jesuits, while claiming to deal with cases, have blurred cases, have quantified cases in a way that reduces their being particulars.
I'm a bit perplexed about this idea of quantifying cases, because after all, the Jesuits focused on single cases, but I think the divergence was located elsewhere, meaning the relationship between those cases whose individuality Pascal was ready to accept, as you pointed out, and their relationship with the norm. So it's again that tension. And laxity as an easy response to that tension, as you pointed out, I would say.
Splendid. Do you want
Yeah. I would like to because I think it would be useful to our audience as well, to understand more precisely the context of casuistry, because I'm afraid that if the audience learns about casuistry just from our discussion over the provincial letters, we miss other important contexts of casuistry as they historically developed. And again, medieval casuistry can be defined differently than in modern times or early modern times. But let me remind you that within the Jesuit context, casuistry was included as a part of school curriculum. All right? It's present in the Ratio Studiorum, 1599, the official edition. And from the rhetorical perspective, I would define casuistry as an art of applying general rules and norms to specific circumstances. And I would agree that casuistry within the school context, Jesuit school context, was an exercise of mind. Casuistry was important in the Jesuit curriculum because Jesuit masters thought that every student needs to develop a intellectual capacity of exactly understanding the rules and applying those general rules to these specific circumstances. So this is one context. Now, what we have here, yes, it's mostly printed production, right, of what Jesuits wrote on casuistry. But again, here we have at least two different genres, because we have manuals for confessors, so there is a very practical concern of Jesuits to use casuistry within the context of sacramental confession. But we have also manuals of moral theology, because actually moral theology as discipline developed because of casuistry, Jesuit casuistry, in a more specific, in a more disciplinary way. And this is why I thought I could also offer another term. We're discussing about the distinction between the reception and consequences. Well, how about ramifications? Because ramifications to me, well, it's ramus in Latin is branch, right? So we have a tree, so we have a text, right? And we have branches that grow out of that trunk, right? Some of them can present consequences, but not necessarily. So I think if we use the term ramifications, we can look at the text and its aftermath. And finally, I would like to reflect a little bit about the impact of the Enlightenment, of the character of the Enlightenment. It is my understanding that, and we're debating that as historians, to what extent the Enlightenment initiated modernity, and to what extent it had or had not Christian roots. And there is much of recent scholarship pointing out, first of all, that there were enlightenments in plural. Okay, so we need to be more precise when we talk about the Enlightenment. I understand we talk about the French Enlightenment, because consider that, and I'm not saying that because I'm Polish, but in Poland, the Enlightenment had almost exclusively Catholic character, all right? And who built the Enlightenment in Poland were the Jesuits, all right? And because it coincided with the suppression of the order in 1773, as you know, 90% of the newly established National Ministry of Education in Poland was made of Jesuits, all right? So it's telling. And also I think that we need to explore a little bit more the connection between the Jesuits and philosophers. You know, there was this Journal de Trévoux, in which Jesuits wrote, at least initially, articles which were enthusiastic about philosophers. Definitely we are discovering recently about the contributions of Jesuits to sciences. And again, Pombal, in the Portuguese context, used the myth of Jesuits as obscure to suppress them. But today we know that Portuguese modern science was built by the Jesuits. So there's a lot of, I think, ideological misinterpretations here. And again, the more I explore Voltaire, the more I see him, at least in his epistemological and anthropological approaches, as I mentioned in my intervention 2 days ago, closer to the Jesuits that we might imagine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, Francis, I realize you haven't had a word
Well,
since
I was
we-
just curious in what sense enlightenment, in the sense of considering no first principle or no doctrine to be immune from possible re-examination or critical reflection. Would you say that the Jesuits were open to that idea, so that, arguments for the existence of God or historical evidence for events cataloged in the Old Testament, would they have been open to that sort of basic reevaluation? That surely is part of enlightenment, that there is nothing that is immune to reexamination and reflection on the basis of reason. Were they open to that? I'm just curious. It's a question.
I would say they were. Again, one of the Jesuit authors that are in vogue right now is Francisco Suarez. Why? Because suddenly scholars are discovering the seeds of what they would call the Enlightenment modernity. So, for example, the relationship between natural rights in Locke can be traced very nicely in the writings of Suarez. And Suarez was a casuist as well. Uh-huh. And the argument for example, when the subjects can overthrow the government, which is a very nice casuistical situation, right?
Yeah, well, I wasn't thinking so much about Locke, who was, a believer in the natural law, even in the state of nature, which is one reason, he believed that people could overthrow the government, unlike, let's say, a Hobbesian. Right. But someone like Hume's dialogues on natural religion. I mean, Hume was the ultimate skeptic, right? And I'm just curious whether the Jesuits would have been open to examination and, in their schools, for example, would they have signed Hume's dialogues on natural religion to children to see whether they could test the development of their rational capacities? Would they? I'm just curious.
May I make a sort of naive remark? I mean, to look at the richness of the legacy concerning casuistry seems to me excellent, a very good idea. I mean, we were learning a lot. But I can see a danger, in other words, to forget the fight which was going on. Écraser l'infâme. We should not forget this. It was a violent fight. Even if it was, let's say, it used books and tracts as weapons. Not exclusively, as you know, but so I think that we have to recall this, because otherwise, I mean, everything will become a sort of peaceful conversation, and this was not the case.
Well.
Could I
Oh.
add a point very quickly?
Yes, Lowell. I'm disoriented. Sorry. Yes, please.
Just-
Disembodied voice.
Just a very small footnote to what Francis and Carlo have just been saying, also following on what Robert mentioned. I'm very interested in this conversation because it seems to me that maybe another way of thinking about why casuistry keeps coming back is because it seems to have a very interesting capacity to function as a kind of synaptic gesture, not just insofar as it tries to mediate between principles and exceptions, but because it seems to also capture moments of very, very radical discomfort and sort of lack of fit between tectonic shifts in a given cultural context or moment. For example, in Shakespeare, in Measure for Measure, which is probably the play that most brilliantly captures the casuistical reflex, we see a world moving from the penitential system that Mark was talking about to realpolitik and the Machiavellian world at the end of the play. And we have there in that single expanse of 2.5 hours on stage a kind of snapshot of the longitudinal history of what casuistry had come to attach itself to in modernity. Already in 1604, we already have a view of this. I'd just like to add one other point, which is that in the 20th century, the bioethical questions that Francis was talking about, they appear in science fiction in some very unusually provocative ways. There's a resurgence in late 20th century fiction of Jesuits as casuists who are exploring bioethical questions. James Blish, A Case of Conscience, 1958, wonderful novel that actually takes us right back to the question of what counts as an enlightenment. So there's really, I think, a lot of, I know I've taken us way out of orbit here, but the late 20th century memory of casuistry is also quite fascinating.
And the footnote add a recent book, Casuistry on Stage by Kallendorf, who examines major Iberian theatrical production, which were written by the alumni of Jesuit colleges, who exactly learn rhetoric and casuistry within the rhetorical the classes of rhetoric in their schools, and she showed how casuistry is present in practically on every page of a written play in the Iberian context.
Thank you. Splendid. Well, now the floor is open to our audience. Please. There's a roving mic, actually. We'll come around. There we go.
I have a question about irony, which is especially for Professor Ginzburg and Professor Jordan, and goes back to the remark with which Professor Jordan started, that irony was not something new. It goes back to ancient times, to the church fathers, and then it would seem surprising why the Jesuits would have reacted against this sort of genre that was accepted at the time. And my question is, what was the legitimate and expected reply against irony in the 17th century? Especially because, from our perspective, it seems that you can use irony not only against enemies, but also against friends or even yourself. So would that have been the case in the 17th century, that you could have used irony against a friend? And secondly, from our perspective, the expected or legitimate reply to irony is an ironic reply, or no reply at all, or you can try to take seriously that remark, but that's a lesser reply, but definitely not violence or physical threat, which doesn't seem to have been the case for the 17th century, going back to ancient times, for Socrates. And it's a very modern expectation to think that an ironic comment should only receive back another ironic comment. Yeah.
Well, I think that we have first to recall the paradoxical reaction of the Catholic Church to Le Provinciales. In other words, condemning the Latin translation, but not the original French version. And then condemning...
Other way around.
It's the reverse, isn't it?
Other way.
It condemns the French, but not the Latin.
Not the Latin.
Yeah, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, so why? Because obviously, I mean, the audience was the crucial issue. So irony is a weapon which in principle should be controlled, but if, let's say, it goes to an audience which becomes uncontrollable, and there is that point about even women, well, that's become a political issue. So I think this asymmetry, which has been pointed out by Bale, touches a crucial element in the reception of the Provinciales, not only from the point of view of the audience, but also from the point of view of the Catholic Church.
May I add? Actually, initially I wanted to include a paragraph on that in my intervention, because if you look at the most popular manual of rhetoric, the Arte Rhetorica by Cipriano Soares, which was the standard manual in all Jesuit colleges, many editions, you have paragraphs which define irony. And definitely, Jesuit students were being taught how to use irony as a trope or as a rhetorical figure. Okay, but I think, if I understand correctly, this fight that you described, that was going on about irony, in my opinion, it's about the sources that are being used to employ irony. Meaning biblical roots of irony versus secular philosophers of antiquity. And obviously the Jesuits, with their embracement of antiquity, and especially of Cicero, as we discussed it before, were despised because they were using more willingly non-biblical sources, and that was the reason to Pascal, I think, and other Jansenists to be outraged by that.
Yeah.
If I could tell the story from the other side, Ignatius Eschmann, a great Dominican historian of morals, used to argue that what we're watching at the beginning of the modern period is an enormous, sometimes he said legalization, and at other times literalization of moral speech. So if you go from the 13th century to the 15th or 16th century, what you watch, even within the Dominican order, for example, is the shrinking of the number of acceptable genres in which moral theology may be written. So that you move from a time in which you have this range that runs all the way from satire or allegory through various forms of history, narrative, exhortation, preaching, and way over here you have academic forms of dispute or codification. What happens at the beginning of the modern period in Catholic moral theology is the shrinking of that genre in the direction of academic literal speech, right? Eschmann would attribute this, I think rightly, to changing notions of law, of what law is and how law may be spoken. Because obviously in the scripture, the natural law is spoken as much or more often in narrative as it is in actual numbered proposition. So I think the reaction to Pascal, see, I think in this case, Pascal is being deeply traditional, right? He's going back to patristic and medieval uses of irony. in order to do moral theology. And so the reaction to his monstrosity is actually an indicator of this shift of genres.
So to what,
Sorry.
so to what extent could one see Pascal's irony from the perspective of the Jesuits, not as a use of a genre, like a well-established genre, but actually as an insult? The way in the 17th century insult could lead to a duel and could lead to death. So it's not just a discursive remark, but it's something that has a legal stake. It's much more than an appropriate use of irony in the rhetorical sense or in that tradition. But
Yeah, but just a small point. I mean, so Pascal going back, but at the same time writing a feuilleton. Now, I was able to consult, one of the first editions of the letters. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, just 7 pages, you know. And so, I mean, this was a crucial disruption of the discourse on theology. So it's not only the vernacular, but also, yeah, I mean,
Cheap. It's
cheap.
Anybody
It's
can
cheap. It's cheap. So if you think about the tomes of the church fathers and so on, it's a different audience. It's a different kind of communication. It's not simply, obviously, going back to the past, is to use, let's say, irony in Genesis and so on, but as a weapon for today.
I quite agree. So the place you would look for the equivalent in the Middle Ages would be in preaching. Right. So in the sermons of Bernardino of Siena, for example, you have an excoriating use of insult, irony, satire, etc., etc. Only, of course, it's being spoken, right, because of the means of production.
Please.
I was wondering, it's not a naive question, but to what extent were these pseudonyms transparent to contemporary audiences, or to what extent were they really hiding identity? Like we know now, or you've been able to identify many of these people and who they were. To the contemporary audience, were they really hiding everybody, or were they still revealing, oh, that person must be that person?
I would say they were not transparent. In the case of Pascal, certainly, very few people knew about this, including, the Jesuits. Right. They were unable to identify him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it was a fight.
Because there was a fight? Yeah, but also because, he was not in the forefront and he had been doing something different. So, no, it was unexpected. It was a secret.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just on this question of irony, I wonder if it's possible to get a response to the idea that what we were facing at the time was really an ideological fight, écraser l'infâme, vis-à-vis the positing of a different logic. I'm thinking of Ram's logic in particular against the Catholic Aristotelian logic. And seen in that light, is it the case then that irony is just a tool used by either side as best they can to achieve their goals of power, basically, of destroying the other or relativizing the power of the other? So Ramist philosophy and logic, as opposed to Aristotelian logic, could you say something about that? Perhaps that will also link in the idea of casuistry within that context, because I think within that context, we're not talking about individual cases and general principles. We're looking at political power, or let's say religious power in that sense.
Would you like to comment on this?
It's partly, I feel the spirit of Walter Ong hovering over the room. Yes, so clearly Ramist logic marks a change. A change for whom and how circulated, I think, is a complicated question. So it's not as if the Ramist logic was the tool simply of one party, as opposed to an Aristotelian logic that would be in another. But I do support your larger point. I think one of the things, one of the reasons why in the provincial letters Pascal seeks to identify Jesuit casuistry with nominalism is that he regards nominalism as a political tool It's a way of detaching language from its ordinary references that makes language, especially moral language, entirely plastic or pliable in the hands of certain institutions of power. So in that sense, yes, there's, I think, a very direct connection in Pascal's mind between a certain logic, or at least a certain semantics, and political manipulation.
Can I just come back on that point? Do you think then that the Pascalian approach resulted in a kind of dogmatism which casuistry, in a sense of I start with a particular assumption, everything can be explained through my particular way of thinking about God, and explaining things that way, describing things that way, results in the type of misuse of the word of casuistry that we see today, where people basically have become very ideological and political about how they think about certain things and the way they argue as a result. And we see that perhaps even today in the current political debate, where there is the also decodification of words and meaning and lack of meaning, and it's all about one side against the other.
So I do wonder, and this goes exactly to Francis's remarks, I do wonder, well, it would be very interesting to ask where the casuistical spirit, in Pascal's sense, now lodges, whether it is in the use of moral cases or somewhere else, as you're suggesting.
Splendid. Please.
Thank you. I have two comments. The first is purely empirical. When I was a student in high school in the 1960s, I was given a book put out by the ETS, Educational Testing Service in Princeton, to study for the SATs, and the word casuistry was there, and it was defined, I remember very clearly because I had not encountered the word before, as a form of chicanery. And so it shows the influence of Pascal and Voltaire into 1960s. The second observation builds on what Lowell said and also what Maryks said about the increasing role of law. I think of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, which is a perfect example within itself in my mind of a form of consideration of principles and then the question of magisterial consideration case by case. So that in fact it's very difficult to pin Mill down about how he would consider any particular case. So this question of the non-ideological, empirical British magisterial case-by-case consideration and paradoxes of incommensurability as part of the human condition takes us into the work of Isaiah Berlin. So I see a kind of filiation there. I wonder if anyone would like to comment on that. Thank you, all of you, for your wonderful contributions.
Well, I think that you made a point, Mark, about, let's say, the relationship between les Provinciales and les Pensées. So I think that when, let's say, the word ideological is suggested in order to locate Pascal's attitude, I would say, well, let's look at the extremely intricate relationship between those two Pascals, and there are other Pascals, like the scientists and so on, and it's very difficult to, in my view, to label Pascal as ideological. Le Pensées in themselves, since they are not a book, but the relics of a project, raise a lot of problems. The continuity between Le Provinciales and Le Pensées are also striking. I think you mentioned before our seminar the fragment on wager, which is in fact put in a form of a dialogue. So le pari is in fact a conversation in order to convince somebody that le pari is the wager is the best possible solution. So, I mean, there is the dialogic dimension in Le Pensées, and there is also a case dimension. Now, this has certainly a long posterity. I think that it's still helpful to look at the Le Provinciales as a text, as it was constructed, step by step, with changes in between, looking at the context, as maybe a text with, I wouldn't say multiple authors, but certainly as the result of a, cooperation, and then having the mark of an incredible writer. Because if, let's say, Pascal would not have impressed that mark, we would not be talking today about Le Provinciales. That seems to be clear.
Yeah, may I just say something about the point that was raised here? I mean, insofar as you're thinking about will a decision in a particular case with the particular factors that it has tell you anything about other cases, can it set a precedent? Can it be a type and not only a token? I mean, this is where the nominalism versus non-nominalism comes in. It may be the case that when you are case-oriented, all right, and you're focusing on making a decision in this case. I mean, there was a time when philosophers didn't have many jobs and they wore beepers. They were on call at hospitals to advise doctors, what shall I do with this patient, okay? You're very careful to see that the factor that you think is determinative in this case may not be determinative in another because of the addition of other factors in another case. So you don't want to try necessarily to develop any sort of principles. There is a branch of, or a theory in philosophy, modern moral philosophy, called particularism, which is concerned with that view. A very well-known exponent is Jonathan Dancy, a professor originally at Reading, I think, and then at Texas. So you might look up some of his works. But I think many people, I myself think that once your eyes are open to the presence or the relevance of a particular factor in one case, you're always carrying that knowledge with you when you look at another case. So you've been made aware of the relevance of a factor that hasn't been noticed before or is not present in any principle so far, right? And while it may not be determinative in another case, you're always sensitive to its presence or its absence, and you want to think about it, all right? So in that sense, there's a continuing effect, although it may not take the form of the same decision, virtue of the same type. I think that's my approach on your answer, to your question.
I would like to make a comment on your remark, starting from my own experience, once again, the experience of a historian, dealing with cases, with case studies, and why. I already pointed out the obvious connection between case studies as a genre and casuistry. But I think the idea is, for a historian today, and I'm thinking about myself and fellow historians, is that this case study approach is more rich because it questions existing generalizations and it paves the way to better generalizations. So in that sense, it's not, let's say, related to a cult for the fragment, the idea that any case is different, all cases are different, and so on. No, I think the idea is that some cases are better than others, more rewarding, more rich. And then it would be possible in principle to start from those cases in order to provide generalizations. On which basis? Starting from the questions, starting from the answers, it's an open issue. And I think that, let's say, this connection between cases, case studies, and generalizations should be at the very center of a reflection on the historical profession today.
Please. Microphone.
Thank you, particularly for the last remark. I wanted to ask Professor Ginzburg to think out loud some more, if you will, about the connection of a number of words which have come up among the different speakers between case and example, which Mark Jordan introduced as a kind of medieval model, that right away leads us to example as both as particular but also exemplary, a general model. And that also takes us to the question of norm and the degree to which examination of a case leads to a norm or questions a norm, and the kind of rich sense of the possibility of a case, which you've just presented as not destroying the general, but rather as building better models of the general. And so in all of that, I continue to wonder about the role of irony, because it seems to me that in Francis Kamm's use of humor as a kind of, this is something that should be set aside. It may be useful for various purposes, but it's not part of the content. It's not part of the real methodology. Whereas it seems to me that what you were talking about is that irony, in some bizarre, perhaps paradoxical way, passes between method and content. That is to say that irony represents a kind of point of view about the possibility of never quite crystallizing the generalization, because there's always the possibility of some kind of ambiguity inherent in irony, which displaces us. It's not this, it's perhaps that. It's not this, it is perhaps something else.
Well, thank you. I have to think about that. But let me say first, okay, we have this notion of exemplum, and this goes back to, an ancient perception of history as magistra vitae. So this is something which is really distant from us. Then there is the notion of exemplary cases, which, maybe can work tentatively in some cases, but maybe this is not the focus of my attention. In other words, maybe afterwards we can say that some cases can be regarded or were regarded as exemplary, but or particularly fruitful. But I think that to me, generalization should work in a more intricate and perplexing way. Now, is irony involved in this? Well, it depends from our definition of irony. I mean, I must say I'm interested in irony as a topic for reflection, but I never thought that my particular approach to history involved irony. If one would say, and you were probably suggesting this, that the idea that the results of research are never definitive, as a sort of ironical overtone, well, I would accept this, but this is a questionable definition of irony, I would say. Let me quickly recall a point which I made elsewhere. Why, from a cognitive point of view, exceptions are more rewarding than norms as a case studies? Because norms can never, normal case, if it exists, can never foresee all the possible violations of the norm. On the contrary, every exceptional case necessarily implies the norm it violates. Now, I put forward this argument a long time ago, and then a Brazilian historian pointed to me that this was, many years later, this was the argument actually put forward by Carl Schmitt in his Politische Theologie, which a book which I read afterwards. So for some reason I came across the same idea, which in fact was not Carl Schmitt's idea, because he referred to a Protestant theologian. Now, I think this remark says a lot about Schmitt's ideological commitment in several directions, not incompatible at that time. The Protestant theologian was Kierkegaard. So he made actually this point. In other words, that exceptions are more rewarding. This is something completely different from, let's say, Foucault's ideological commitment to Pierre Rivière and so on and so forth. I have no sympathy for this kind of argument. My argument is completely different. Is about the cognitive richness of exceptions.
Could I say something about this question? I think one of the things I was trying to point to when I said that in modern moral philosophy of a certain sort, the cases not only serve as counterexamples or thought experiments used as counterexamples, but they could be the basis for constructing better, more refined principles. So the idea is that you can see with that a way to improve the principles. So I think here, we very much agree. I do think there's a difference between a case and an example. I mean, when I think about a case, I think about, here's someone presenting a universalization of a certain sort. One counter case is enough to defeat a universal claim. All swans are black, you find one white swan, or the reverse, all swans are white, you find a black swan, there goes the universalization, okay? But an example is something that, for example, when I was giving the examples of the way modern moral philosophy is done, there was supposed to be culling. They were supposed to be representative of the type. They were a part of the whole, okay? And they reflected the whole. They gave you some idea of what was not there, but was the other examples that I wouldn't have time to present to you, okay? So example, to me, has something else there. And there can be either an exemplary case or an exemplary example. So a case that really does defeat a universalization, right, could be exemplary, all right, because it's exactly spot on. But there could be an exemplary example, which has that implication of being representative of a type. That's my take on some of these distinctions.
As a footnote, I think the best introduction to the notion of cases I am aware of is a chapter in a book by André Jolles, Einfache Formen. The chapter on casus is magnificent. Yeah. Jolles had an extremely tragic life. I mean, he was in his youth, he was a friend of Huizinga, friend of Aby Warburg. Then he became a committed Nazi. He committed, and then he committed suicide in 1946. This book, which was published in 1930, I think, Einfache Formen, is a really challenging book. And I think the best chapter is on a different literary genre from a morphological point of view, and especially challenging for a historian because it's so ahistorical. And the chapter on casus is, in my view, the best.
Sure.
Hello, my name's Joseph Laus de la Louvière. I have a question about this subject of proof that's come up, especially in the first lecture. I was thinking of this, of the question of proof in relation to the statement, the idiomatic phrase, the exception that proves the rule. And it seems to me a sort of ambiguous statement, partly, well, for two reasons, I guess. One, partly because the idea of a particular exception, as you put it, Professor Ginzburg, reinscribing the norm that it violates is a kind of paradox. But also for the second reason that the term proof in that phrase, the exception that proves the rule, has been understood, I think, ambiguously. That is to say, as a confirmation on the one hand, and contradictorily as a test on the other. And that has something interesting to say about the question of scientific experiment. If we find a case that violates a universal, we have to revise up our universal claim. But in your method of historical inquiry, Professor Ginzburg, there's a kind of use of exceptions in a sense to confirm, but also destabilize norms somehow. So I'm just seeing this relation between exception and norm as being mediated through this concept of proof as, proof as confirmation, proof as test. It's interesting. And I ask this sort of naively as someone who otherwise studies history, but this may just be a question of etymology, namely what is the meaning of the word proof in that particular phrase. But it strikes me as particularly fruitful in the context of the debate between the Jesuits and Pascal and the Jesuits and Fabricius. So I just wonder if you could reflect on that and connect that maybe to so how proof connects to the discussion of examples of exceptions and norms, and whether, as historians we can arrive at satisfying proofs, or whether that will just continue to be testing the claims that we make.
Thank you. Well, the sentence, the exceptions proves the rule, is included by Flaubert in his Dictionnaire des idées reçues. Actually, I never used it, and I think that I would like to clarify my point, because when I said the exception is more rich, because it includes the norm, which is different. Mm-hmm. It's different. Now, on the one hand, we have this, and on the other, when I'm talking about proof, I'm talking about something which is related to my way of dealing with either an alleged normal case or an exceptional case. So it's something which is related to the construction of the argument. We have evidence, and then we may try to construct an argument on the basis of the evidence. This would lead to proof, which would be, in principle, refutable. Now, I used this word proof a few times, and actually I made in my 2 lectures a series of arguments which are, in principle, refutable. For instance, Nicolas Perrault providing material, and so on and so forth. So I try to stress, maybe with too many details, the construction of the proof, because I think this is important in order to clarify where I stand. I think nowadays it's important to stress this element of proof as a crucial element in historical arguments. It's sometimes a long chain, and this is important because every link in the chain can be refuted. And actually, I'm very much interested in the way in which an historical argument, can be refuted. There is a technical element which I think it would be interesting to discuss. So I can imagine, let's say, a book based on refuted cases, focusing on the way in which they have been refuted. This would be, I think, quite interesting.
I just want, there are different senses of rule that may be relevant here. First of all, principle and a rule are 2 different things. If it's the rule in the no smoking car says no smoking, it's like a principle that one ought not to smoke. It's just, it's a fixed rule, right? So any action contrary is inconsistent with the rule. But there are what are known as rules of thumb, all right? Consequentialist utilitarians use them very often. For the most part, right? Mill in his writings refers to them, the wisdom of humanity that is filtered down to us, for the most part, something. And so when there's an exception to that sort of a rule, all right, it's not so much that it proves it, it's just that it's not thought to be inconsistent with it, because it was always thought to be, for the most part, it was to allow for the exception. I guess in the case where an exception proves the rule, if you thought that the exception was truly in a rare instance, okay, then for the most part, a rule of thumb would in fact continue to be proven, because see how rare the cases are where it does not apply, and all I ever intended to imply was that it was a rule of thumb. That's one way on Mill's view of a rule, that might, those 2 things could be made consistent. Just
I think maybe we just have one last question.
I'm Eric Rasmussen, an economist. I've been studying Machiavelli lately, and he, too, takes historical little examples from recent or ancient history and constructs general rules from them with a lot of humor, and then was attacked by Innocent Gentillet, and I don't know how, yeah, so he nods his head on him, who also used a lot of humor in counterattacking him. And I was wondering if Pascal would have read Gentillet and Machiavelli, because he has the same sort of project of trying to reveal and refute subversive writings.
Yeah, good question. I made an argument about Pascal reading Il Principe in Italian and also in the French translation provided by Gaspard Lauvergne. I assume that, a reading of Gentillet would have been highly possible. I never checked for specific echoes, but this would be an interesting suggestion. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid 12 o'clock has come around. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks so much to Carlo Ginzburg, especially, of course, to our 4 wonderful commentators, bringing perspectives from many disciplines, as have you. So we look forward to, I know I have much food for thought, and we look forward to future publications of all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.